So hi everyone, good afternoon. Welcome to Easing Contemporary and today's event with our very dear guest speaker Adele Patrick. My name is Dot. I work as a curator at Easy Contemporary and we are UK's only non-profit art centre specializing in presenting and platforming artists and art practices that are identified and are informed by East and Southeast Asian cultural backgrounds. So today we are super delighted to have Adele with us on site for this talk as part of our ongoing program, Publishing Otherwise. So this talk is titled The Power, Purpose, and Politics of Publishing Otherwise, Perspectives from Adele Patrick, co-founder and co-director of Glasgow Women's Library. So Adele has been developing innovative cultural projects rooted in equalities and in academic research and community learning and teaching for over 30 years. Adele co-founded Glasgow Women's Library in 1991 and is currently its co-director. She has had a key leadership role in Glasgow Women's Library, which has grown from a grassroots project led by volunteers into a recognized collection of national significance, the sole accredited museum dedicated to women's history in the UK, and an influential change-making organization in the museum, library, and wider culture sectors. So Adele is a collaborator with writers, visual artists, filmmakers, architects, and performers. Adele was awarded an Engage Scholarship for Excellence in Gallery Education in 2016. She writes for academic professionals and popular journals and publications and regularly speaks at national and international conferences. After her CLOR Leadership Fellowship in 2018-2019 and post-fellowship research, she has been involved in work including a book project on intersectional feminist leadership and what we can learn from countercultural resources. In her talk today, Adele will delve into the purpose of publishing, both in the past and the present, while also looking into the future. Drawing from her extensive experience of collaborative and cross-disciplinary work with writers, designers, architects, and other creatives, she will discuss her contributions to and co-designing of publications, and this includes a wide spectrum from artist books to academic journals, from zines to manifestos, all while exploring the enduring drive to publish. And she has very kindly brought with her today some of her personal collections as well from the Women's Library collection with her, which you are very welcome to browse after her talk today. So yeah, I'll hand over to Adele now, and let's give her a warm applause.
Thanks so much, Dot, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. This is like magic, having one of these on and you can hear your voice around the room. So yeah, I couldn't be more delighted to be here and to be in Manchester again. I mean, Manchester is really important to me. It's a place that was like just a wonderland for me when I was growing up in Doncaster. You can imagine, it was like an amazing metropolis, but it's so fantastic as well to be here in esea at this particular time in this organisation's history. Very, very excited to think about what's going to happen next here. Obviously, very, very happy to be here while this remarkable show is on. I would really recommend everybody who's not had a chance to go and see the show to spend time with it because it is pretty knockout. And yes, I'm hoping today there are some little touch points in terms of some of the ambitions that there are for this remarkable institution and some of the things that I've been doing over the last wee while. So yes, I thought if it's okay, I'm going to be sort of fairly informal, but because I don't know if anybody's actually visited Glasgow Women's Library. Is anybody? Oh, yeah, wow. Great stuff, fantastic. So everybody's very, very warmly welcome if in a return visit as well, if you would like to. But yes, it's quite a sort of idiosyncratic, strange organisation, almost like the unique organisation that esea is. Women's Library is also very, very specialised, but also sort of quite wide-ranging in similar ways with archives, showing creatives, germinating new projects. and I suppose being an incubation space for ideas and with publications at its heart. So I thought what I could do is maybe show some little images that give you an idea about Women's Library, but also I might be getting up and passing around some of these texts as Dot mentioned. So you've heard a little bit about me. That was such a beautiful and kind intro, Dot. But I suppose one of the things I wanted to mention is about my own life and practice being quite, I think they use the term hybrid now, don't they? So I've been doing different things on different registers, and quite a lot of my own work, for example, running a women's library, I feel like I'm a little bit of an imposter because I'm not trained as a librarian. I'm not a collections professional. My background was as an artist. But I do, in all the work that I'm doing, there's some relationship, or I've discovered, just having been invited to do this talk, that there's relationship to books, to reading, to writing, and to publishing. So I mentioned that I do run this library resource. That is an archive and a museum, and that we do, that I write and publish things myself, but also the organisation is responsible for commissioning lots of publications and for artists to make books with us. We're involved in co-editing, and I've been involved in art directing and developing different types of publications, as you'll discover. And I was trying to think about when this drive to make, we're going to talk a little bit about why people do want to make things, why they do want to make beautiful ephemeral things like the things that you can see on the shelves there, and artist books, catalogues, publications and so on, especially now we're in the digital world. What is the compulsion to keep making? But I was trying to think about when I first started making things, and I suppose one of the first publications that I made was this very, very handmade thing. This is the year before the World Wide Web starts. So why would you make a publication like this? And I suppose partly it was to do with rage, partly it was to do with there isn't anything like this. So this was a catalogue, a publication, a sort of manifesto of sorts from 1990. And you can see, I think I had actually seen Sinning Over, or another countercultural feminist organisation, had used these little rings to make, so I can't claim credit for this. Not that it's the easiest thing to manage. But this is literally sort of handmade. So I do remember the particular type of calluses that you actually create when you're making a book like this time and time again. But yeah, this is a publication that was about women working in the visual arts in Glasgow. And I was talking to Joanne earlier on about how, so for example, the beautiful exhibition that's through the door there, what happens when shows like that have had a month or more investment of literal putting things into spaces and making decisions about how they're going to impact on people, that they then leave, the space changes, it gets cleared, it goes, and like, it's in our memory, and it may be vividly in our memory, but how important it is to actually have material records as well. I know tomorrow there's going to be a launch of a publication, and my heart lifted because the idea that when publications remain, because even a relative short space of time since that's published, none of the young people who work in our organisation would know about that at all. It just, things evaporate very, very quickly, and I think especially in countercultural organisations, or organisations that don't have, lots and lots of core funding. So, yeah, I was still, I think I'd I think I might have still just been a student when I was involved in this project called Women in Profile, that the following year after that was when the Women's Library started. So you can tell that there's something brewing there, that it's not just a wee flash in the pan. This was a sort of exhibition, part of a big programme of work that myself and loads of other people were involved in, that was around the time that Glasgow was reinventing itself as a cultural capital. I mean, I think Manchester's well overtaken any ambitions that Glasgow might have had. I think the city here is thriving and feels like a culture-led organisation. But at the time we were in a city that was post-industrial, like Manchester, in a bit of a sort of stuck state, and had decided to reinvent itself as a cultural capital. But we'd heard that there was going to be almost like we were going to be European City of Culture in 1990, but the city fathers had decided that the people who were going to carry the beacon into the future in Glasgow were going to be called, were almost dubbed the Glasgow Boys. The men who are going to be, and the clues in the name, you know, there's going to be a group of male artists, actually nice people, but I think you'd call it now pale male style to a degree. So we thought, well, we know that there are women, we know that there are people of colour, we know that there are others who need to get represented during the City of Culture year, when audiences from around the world are going to come to Glasgow and ask what Glasgow's culture is, that we know that it's not just white men. So that was really the rage that was sitting behind that. It's like, well, what about the women? So over the years, I suppose the library has grown and grown and grown in the way that Dot mentioned, from being a really, really rough, you know, underfunded, scratchy women's organisation run by volunteers. And so I think we've now got 26 staff or 27 staff, and we are in a lovely space now. But all our work over the years as we've grown has been anchored in equalities. And I wanted to mention this because I think that it's reflected in the publications that we host and hold in our collections, this link between activism, this will to make that manifest in publications, almost like the agency of publishing, and the idea of voices being unleashed, and a politics almost of material culture. And I was looking at some of the beautiful zines that are on the shelf over there and thinking, we have these types of things in our collection, not those specific things. I envy you having those gorgeous, gorgeous things there, but almost like these are voices that have maybe not been articulated before. So how, you know, how are they going to be made? Who's going to make them? How can we make sure that they reach audiences, and that we provide a space for things like this to be made by people who need to make them? So I thought I would very briefly show a couple of slides of what's on in the Women's Library just now, just to give you an idea almost of how some of these ephemeral bits of material culture from the past and past publications are on display just now. We've had a little series of little shows in the Women's Library the last wee while by a small group of curators and archivists who've been going through our history of the last 33 years. Yeah, we had our birthday at the start of the week, so 33 years of the Women's Library. And you can see some of the young people who are involved in the organisation are deeply fascinated in the pre-digital stuff like this. It's almost like it is very alluring and very exciting for them. So in this little show here, you can see the way that there's like little booklets and little posters and things that, you know, when we're making them, you're not thinking that you're making history, but the idea of keeping things and holding on to things. I mean, I'm sure everybody in the room has picked up posters or leaflets or information that has actually ended up being a life-changing event for them that they might have gone to, or something that has changed their mind in one way or another. So the idea of these materials actually remaining, they're often things that just get thrown away. We were talking earlier on about some materials that we've been discovering in our past. We didn't even put the year on them, you know, and now I'm just, anybody who's making anything, make sure that there's a year on them, you know, because very quickly you forget when they were made, what they were made for, and so on and so forth. So I just thought I'd show you some little bits inside the Women's Library and just how modest these wee publications are. This was one of the first newsletters that we made in the Women's Library, and I've got a copy here of one of those, and I thought I might bring this along as well because there is a beautiful little connection here. This is a spring 1998 Women's Library newsletter, and on the cover is an image from a project called Mother House, which was a public artwork that was made for the Women's Library by an artist, Pam So, who exhibited here, was supported actually over a number of years by the former Chinese Art Centre. And there's an article in it as well about Pam So. And I did actually Google Pam just before I came, and you can hardly find anything about somebody who is an absolutely and utterly groundbreaking artist in Scotland, one of the very first women with Chinese heritage who was a professional artist who was working in the city and developing amazing work. So again, it's really important that these records remain, that indicate somebody's profound practice. I also thought that I'd mention that in the corner of the library at the moment is an amazing little mobile library resource. This is not our library, but somebody has actually brought it in who is an artist who's working with us at the moment. And this is a library about from the Feminist Economic Network. And again, on this side there are publications, and on the other side there's more ephemeral zine and other publications. So it's really interesting to see this sort of, as I say, this will to publish still live with lots of other countercultural organisations as well. I wanted to put this slide up from an exhibition that's actually was several years ago now. I think this must have been, in 2017, but it's actually called 1973. And I wanted to show this just because I thought it was a really interesting example almost about how the randomness of publishing can change the way that we think about history. So this is the material records of this choreographer, who's a choreographer and a dance performer called Janice Parker. And Janice has been working in this field since 1973. And these tables here represent all the materials that she's generated in that period, although her practice is dance. And it was really fascinating just to sort of see underneath the table are applications that have gone in for certain types of funding. And one of the things that she had this installation in the library for several weeks, and people were coming in and looking at the materials. But what it taught me was that when organisations or creatives get a block of funding for something, which could be quite random, so during 1990, when it was the City of Culture year, we did get quite a lot of funding. Some of the materials look really swish, and you know, you can pay a designer, or you can pay to have publications made, or you can pay to, and then other times projects that might be as important or even more important that don't get funding, there might be very, very little records left. So in some ways it disproportionately almost like affects the history. So we were talking earlier on about often thinking, what will the records look like to people in 100 years' time? And often thinking that way I think encourages us to publish, because it's not just our experience in the moment, it's what actually remains from that can be important. But how funding can actually shift the weight of a project. During our 30th anniversary projects, we've really noticed that students who've come in to work with us have said, oh, this looks like it was a really important project. And we'll say, well, actually, it wasn't very significant, it wasn't very successful. It's just that it had a lot of funding attached to it, and that's why there's a big book, or that's why there's... So it's really interesting how publishing can actually almost like shift people's perceptions. And I just wanted to mention something briefly here. I'm going to read this out, so please don't worry if you can't read it. When we started the Women's Library, and I think thinking about this institution as well, the impetus is often what is not being shown, what is not being seen, what are the mainstream galleries not doing? In our case, it was like, well, we need to do something about women, and we want to make sure that it's not just white women who are being shown, or the usual suspects. And I think thinking about the history of this institution, it's almost about what is not being shown, what is not being seen, what is not being exhibited. And that's almost like a sort of visceral reaction. It's not something, I didn't do the research, you know, we didn't sort of find out, oh, well, it's just like, it's obvious, this is not happening, we've got to do something. Years after the Women's Library set up, I was on Twitter, which I've now left, and I came across this, and it was about somebody who'd been trained as an archivist many, many years ago. It's a guy called Alistair Tuff, who I think still works at Glasgow University, and he wrote an essay called Thinking About and Working with Archives and Records, and it was a reflection on his practice. And he reveals in this little, this is a Meg Vinter, who's an activist, drawing my attention to it on Twitter, but he says that he talks about the explicit processes of weeding that was in place within the institution of archives in the 80s and 90s when the Women's Library was setting up. And he talks about the training of collections professionals in Scotland, and I'm sure this must have been the case in England as well. So he says, speaking of his own experience, he says, the author, Alistair Tuff, began working in 1975. A senior colleague gave him two memorable pieces of advice during his first week in the archives profession. Firstly, he was told never to waste time on women's papers. And secondly, he was urged to make sure that anything earmarked for disposal was actually destroyed and that no evidence of the matter was kept. So this is evidence that that partial representation that we felt was actually the case, you know, that weeding was happening, that women's papers were not being kept. And I think also we can think about this in terms of other minoritised groups as well, that there is no records, there's very little evidence. And Meg Vinter, who's another activist archivist, has suggested it might be a reason why the National Register of Archives in Scotland has 46,000 personal records for men and 4,000 for women. So this idea of gendered weeding, we'd felt it in our waters, but the reality is that has actually been happening. So I suppose just with that in mind, when we're thinking about this institution setting up, the Women's Library setting up, there are so few publications. You know, thinking about the 80s, there were not, I mean, fortunately now, the wonderful array of new texts that I'm seeing coming into the institution, a wonderful array of texts now. If you want to find out about artists of colour, or you want to know about queer Chinese artists, you know, there are publications now that we can discover and we can read, and as well as the internet and so on. But I feel still that there's a publicising. Oh, thank you very much, Ewan. Please do pass that round. I think this desire to make publications of one sort or another really was a motor behind the Women's Library making things, however humble. So some of these publications are really very basic, but they are, nevertheless, it was important for us to make them. A publication like She Settles in the Shields, this is more substantial. We did actually get some proper funding for this. This also came out of a sense of rage. So my colleague, Saima Ahmed, we were trying to do some work in the archive with South Asian women. There are a big community of South Asian people in Glasgow, and we went to the Mitchell Library, which is the biggest reference library in Europe, based in Glasgow, to sort of find out more about histories of migration. This is many years ago now, 11 years ago, because we wanted to do more about what migration was like for women coming to Glasgow, and there was literally nothing at all in the main archive. So Saima started working on this particular publication and an exhibition that went along with it as well. And I was talking to Joan about this as well, that in the process of working on a project like this, wonderful communities of women find ownership in the collection as well and start making their own publications too. So that whole process of making it concrete is very, very, very important, I think, for people. When you see your name or your relative's photograph in a publication, or your words in it, or your, evidence that you have lived and your heritage is important, is a political act. This publication, this Elbow Room one, I wanted to mention this because this relates a little bit to another topic that we were talking about earlier on, about how the difficulties of thinking about publications with communities who are not confident readers or don't have English as a first language and who might feel it's not for them and that publications are not for them. And I just wanted to sort of mention this little thing that sometimes we use with communities. It's called spine poems. And we work with groups to not ask them to read all the books, but to look at the words on the spines of publications and make little poems from the words that are on the publications. And over the years, we've tried to find lots of different ways that we can create meaningful publications without people having to write loads or read loads or whatever. So yes, and the topics that we've covered, again, thinking about some of the things that are in the on these beautiful shelves over here, we've tried to go into areas that are really controversial as well for us. I think there's oh no, it's here. We've done work around sex, we've done things around honour-based violence, we've done loads of things about violence against women, lots of different things in the Women's Library. And this particular publication here, again, lots of people may not be aware that in Glasgow there's still masses of sectarian violence taking place, lots and lots of issues that are associated with Protestant and Catholic communities that are still, there are divides there, there's work to be done. And we moved into, I think, 12 years ago now, we moved into our beautiful new premises, and we did a consultation with our communities about how they felt about the possibility of moving to a new space. And a lot of women were saying the area that you move into, it's really heavy in terms of sectarianism. It's a challenging area. So we thought we'll need to start researching how women feel about sectarianism. And again, no publications, no films, no pamphlets, no articles, nothing at all. quite a bit about male violence, about football violence, about sectarianism and man and the marches and so on and so forth. Some of you will have seen the Orange Marches being portrayed in Belfast. There are more marches in Glasgow than there are in the whole of Northern Ireland each marching season. In Glasgow, and our area is a focus for that. So instead of just thinking, la, 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 we won't think about that horrible thing, we thought, right, we need to do some work on it. And a publication, this idea of not finding a publication on it anywhere else, it felt important to commission new work there. So I thought that you might want to see an image of the Women's Library itself, and it just having had this invitation, I was thinking, actually, texts are on the facade of the building as well, that titles of some of our publications and other publications actually feature on the outside of the building as well. And thinking about, hello, please join, you know, just sort of thinking about how we can encourage people through the door, often using texts or using referencing published material as well on the facade of the building. One of our most recent publications is our Net Zero Handbook as well, and I suppose it's an example of a text that we've decided not to make multiple copies for obvious reasons and to have a digital version, but again thinking about in 100 years' time how poignant this publication might be to have made at this particular time in history, and what our ambitions are. So our ambitions are to be the first net zero museum if we can manage it. This is our iconic carpet, which I can't go into our iconic carpet just now, but just it's something that people love. So I wanted to mention a little bit. We've got hundreds and hundreds of artist books in the collection, but this is a little series. I was trying to think about the last batch of artist books that had been made, and I thought it was interesting because it was artist books that had been made as a collaboration between the artist Ingrid Pollard and a community of community of people who use the library. And what Ingrid had done was to find, in our collection we have quite a lot of duplicate texts, so texts that maybe we don't need anymore or are not necessarily appropriate to use in the collection. And our librarian was going to sort of give them away or give them to a book sale. And Ingrid worked with a group to customise these books into almost like little keepsakes or like beautiful books that could be given to people who were in the process of coming out. So Ingrid personally cut these little cavities into the books, and then people took these away and filled them, customised them, and then filled them with little objects that almost like to gift to somebody who was thinking about that process. And you can see here, this is another one. And it was just like a really, really beautiful workshop, but also, again, thinking about some of the texts that you've got there, you know, like how communities support each other through texts. Like some of the texts that were being used, the original books were iconic books. So it's just a really, really lovely sort of exercise. And Ingrid herself made these tiny little books that sat on our bookshelves, but again, with mindful of almost like how maybe some users of the library might find it difficult to sort of pour through loads of text, had these really, really gorgeous recordings, which at points when there were lots of people in the library, the buttons would have all been pushed and there was almost like this chorus of voices. The voices were of women who had been involved in black lesbian activism, or women of colour who had been activists throughout their lives. And This is a poster that as a young woman I remember on being on so many walls in different people's bedsits and, you know, in community places in the 80s. This says lesbian in lots of different languages. And Ingrid had kept in contact. It was a poster that Ingrid Pollard had made as a sort of activist artist. But she wanted to get in touch with the person who'd sat for the poster all those years ago and interview her about her life now. Because I suppose in some publications, it's like this idea of people being in aspic, you know, that they're in history and they've not had a life after. You know, so the idea of an 80s artist or a 70s activist or whatever. So Ingrid made, I can't remember how many, it might have been 12, interviewed people, photographed them, and then almost inserted them in the bookshelves. And what I really loved about it was so unbelievably powerful that actually these beautiful little audio things and these little books almost like spoke to all the books on the bookshelves, the hundreds and hundreds of books we've got in the women's library, almost animating all the books around them as well, almost like each of these books represented the labour of all these activists from the 70s, 80s, 90s and onwards. There are other little things. Oh yes, there it is. Some other publications that we've been making over the last wee while, this is the one that's on the screen in the middle just now, I suppose have this iterative process. So you can see some of the text here, and I should say that every single publication, everything in our collection, everything in the archive has been donated. So it's almost like these are loved books. It's not just people who are, you know, moving house and they can't be bothered going to the Oxfam shop or whatever to deposit their books. These are things that are really treasured, that we get handed in. But in some instances, the texts that we make speak to some of the other texts in the collection. So this was a big exhibition and almost like a revisiting of one of our early projects, which is called Castlemilk Woman House, by an artist who made a new work related to that. But these were some of the texts that the artist herself had found helpful in making that work. So I love the idea of things that we're making that speak to some of the items within the collection. Maybe I don't need to speak so much about this. It's just that I've noticed, and I'm sure, Joanne, you will know better than I do as a sort of proper curator, that I'm noticing that now it's getting very much more usual to see exhibitions where artists are actually revealing their reading and their thinking alongside the exhibition. You know, so some people, in the past certainly there would be an exhibition and you're supposed to just fathom it, and you know there's a mystery sitting behind it. There's almost like this idea of the genius artist who ideas just emerge, and you know you shouldn't be fathoming what's going on behind it. But I'm really interested to see, this was a show that was out in Menorca at Hauser and Wirth 3 weeks ago, whatever, that Christina Qualls is showing here all the texts that she wants the audience to understand had been important to her. You know, and I really like this idea, and I like the fact that it's happening here in this gallery, and that, you know, in Women's Library as well, when we have exhibitions, it is almost like, if you want to go on the journey that an artist, but it's not that you're going to generate the same text, but there's some sort of like importance of some of the texts that are there in the background. I mentioned Pam's work earlier on, and I think there is a catalogue. Is that already circulating? Maybe it's...
I think it's in the office.
Don't worry, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter at all.
There's a lot of things here.
Oh, don't worry, that's fine. Thank you so much. Yes, I suppose I just wanted to reiterate that idea of how important, even well, say even when there's catalogues that might only be simple ones, that the evidence of something that happened is so important still, even though I might say it's on a website, you know, but paper, these things will stay, you know, forever. Well, possibly not forever, but we know that they will last for a long, 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 long time. And that there's something, I think, where there's this, we're living in the post-truth era or whatever, there's something concrete about this. These artists survived. They did make things. This did happen at a particular point in history. Yeah, and just how rapidly things are forgotten was one of the reasons why I wanted to just pop that up. So I'm not going to rattle on too much longer, but I just wanted to show you, I suppose, the interior of the original Women's Library because it was so crummy. So in here there was thousands of roll-up cigarettes being smoked and a little kettle and a bike, and that's probably the extent of the collection there. But I suppose that there is that sort of evidence in some of these journals here, which are actually from all over the world. So you can see German women's ones here. We used to have Manushi from India, lots of different journals from all over the world. How this idea of things being published in very different contexts made manifest different traces of thinking that you could imagine yourself as being a Turkish woman artist. You could imagine yourself as being a queer German woman or whatever. So when books and pamphlets, zines and other texts are published, actions are sitting behind them. Just the last wee while, we've started being more proactive in acquiring texts because it's great to have things donated. We were talking earlier on as well about the importance of things being deposited in national collections as well. So having an ISBN, if you see on a publication, it might have an ISBN on it, and you might say, well, what is political about that? It means that if you've got an ISBN, it means it has to be deposited in the British Library, or it has to be deposited in a national library, and therefore is searchable. So we have, as a political act, got ISBNs on all our publications, and I know that your publication being published tomorrow, launched tomorrow, has an ISBN on. So the idea of things being able to exist in the world and be searched is really important. But one of the problems that we have had is, I suppose, great to have things donated. They're often things that are not being donated in other places because of the bonds of trust that are built up with individuals and campaigners and so on and so forth. But there are lots of things missing from our collection. You know, it's partial. We are still subject to colonial thinking and white supremacy and all the things that determine the way that collections evolve. So now we're actually in a process of trying to get budgets to acquire things because we know that that is really important to do. So we had an amazing thing the other day, and I just thought I'd put maybe you can't see the levels of, this is at the end of COVID, levels of excitement here. Somebody contacted us and said, I want to give you 15 grand. They did it through an intermediary, so we don't know who this person is. I want to give you 15 grand, but you have to spend it at this particular second-hand bookshop that is a specialist feminist bookstore. And so, but it was like our collections team who are only ever dealing with things that people are just handing in. I mean, the beautiful things, but have never been able to say, I would like that, I would like that, I want that. It was like, I've never seen them more excited. And the things we got, for example, Yoko Ono's first edition of Grapefruit. We got all these amazing text suffragette materials that, you know, it was just like this incredible. And this was them sort of being gathered for the first time. So we spent ages on it. You know, every penny we made work for us. So I suppose that idea of like acquiring things as well is a political thing in itself. What we do is that we get these boxes out. I've actually brought one of these boxes today, which is sort of like a particular type of archive boxes that we use. We've got thousands and thousands of them. And we have these open archive events really regularly where you could come and leaf through these things. So obviously they're sitting on shelves, but we get them out as regularly as we possibly can and have almost like sessions where people are remembering or people are interpreting, because we might have read something from it and then people say, oh, it was never like that. That newsletter looks very friendly, but we were schisming at the time, or we were falling out, or the editor was like, you know, really pissing us off, whatever it might have been. So there can be these interpretations that are hidden with the publications that can get revealed in what we call the open archive sessions. I think the only other little things that I wanted to say here was this is a tiny little sample of our shelves. So obviously the books are donated, so people feel really, really strongly about the publications. They do have meaning over and above books in a bookstore. Often we will find little annotations or marginalia in the text as well when people are giving them in, and that is really, really fascinating. So there's a different type of relationship to a normal bookstore or library because people have, these are loved items. But also our shelf markers. When we needed money to develop our new space, I think we raised about £2 million. We got a public session to do this thing called Women on the Shelf, and people paid for these blocks and remembered somebody, either somebody who'd influenced them or their grandma. Both my grandmas are on the shelf, different friends and so on and so forth, and a little bit of text about them here. So there's this really lovely relationship between the shelves, the books, and so on and so forth. But you'll also notice this is a classification system that is different from ones that you'd normally find in libraries. So it's not Dewey, and it's not the Library of Congress. It's a feminist classification system. And when we started this classification system, the models for it were Japanese, Indian, and the European women's thesaurus. There are women's libraries all over the world, and quite a lot of our sister organisations had already done this work, almost like looking at decolonising and addressing the way that Dewey is a sort of system that works on the basis of patriarchy, colonial thinking, and so on and so forth, and didn't feel like it was appropriate for a feminist collection. So I just thought I'd mention that because it's another way that we're very peculiar. And yeah, I suppose finally just sort of saying that we try and collect as much as we can. Thank you very much. Oh, and I'll send that one around as well. I suppose this is an example of a catalogue of work that we have done in the Women's Library. Even though we didn't have much of a budget, we thought this show that we'd done recently was so amazing that we would try and make sure that there was a record of it, because it was a wonderful exhibition. But we will try as much as possible to keep models of ephemeral publications of importance. So this is a really, really amazing project in Shetland that we've been working with over the last wee while, but also looking at, we have lots of growing connections now internationally with organisations such as this the organisation that sits behind these beautiful zines here is called Haven for Artists, and it's a project based in Lebanon. And I suppose just sort of thinking back to the start of this wee session about how voices that are being silenced, or lives that are being erased, or cultures or identities that are being sort of minimised or minoritised. Certainly in Lebanon, our sister organisation are doing really brave work in publishing, creating a space and so on and so forth. And their door is a door that, unlike the door that we came through today, is locked. Because if the police arrive, these publications have to be hidden. So there are certainly lots of places in the world where queer identities, different types of identity are still completely outlawed. There's certainly lots of places where books are banned, and I know that we were talking about that earlier on in terms of some of the materials that we might have here might not be available to people to access in other contexts. So we really like to keep books and publications that are making history. You know, so if the situation changes in Lebanon, this is like groundbreaking materials. I think we're more or less at the end of what I wanted to cover here. But just to sort of say, I have got a couple of examples here of some of the, I'm sure that nobody in the room is old enough to even have any idea about what these are, but when I was a young woman, these were like these incredible exotic publications. This is pre-internet. But actually some of the materials, it's quite interesting looking back at these things. I mean, I felt a little bit alienated from these because they were so deeply middle class, and also it just sort of felt like, you know, they were talking about things like Greenham, and I couldn't afford to go to Greenham, or, you know, there was ways in which they didn't chime exactly with where I was coming from. But there are some quite interesting evidence of intersectional thinking. I think a lot of the young people that I'm speaking to just now are almost sort of saying, look, we've evolved to a point where we're thinking about things intersectionally, but actually looking at some of these texts, things are always a little bit more complex than we imagine, and that there's evidence in here that the thinking was happening that was, as it were, intersectional thinking around feminism. And obviously, I mentioned to Dot and Jiwan earlier on that I could have brought the whole library. It was very, very difficult to sort of select, but I just thought I'd bring some examples of some early stuff. And then these are just some little ephemeral texts, I suppose just little examples of some of the very light touch, not ISBN type publications that we've been picking up over the last wee while. This is a beautiful series that has just been published. And I just wanted to mention, obviously I'm working in Women's Library a lot of the time, but I've also been involved in 3 self-build women's housing projects, you know, for my sins. And now, because I'm ancient, I'm in an elders women's housing project. And we were just talking earlier on about, even though this vision might never be built, this idea of an environmental elders housing project that's affordable and eco and all that what you'd want. There's something about making a little booklet with the manifesto of what that's about that makes it feel like it might happen. It's more likely to happen. But again, if it doesn't, it's in the world. And the work that we've done on that, which has already been several years now, there's some evidence that this happened in the world, you know, and I know that when we've been starting other projects in the past, knowing that somebody else has done it beforehand can have a bearing on the way that you you feel about it. So I think that's it. I'm sick of the sound of my own voice, so I don't know, I'm sure everybody else is. These are just some little, in fact, I'm going to leave these as well here. Are just, again, little modest publications, but in Glasgow, well, certainly in Edinburgh, I think there are more statues to dogs than there are to women. And in Glasgow, there's not very many more. And it's a city where the evidence of women's lives, experiences and so on are virtually invisible in the civic landscape. So I've been developing walking tours for many years now, 20 odd years. So these are just sort of walking little publications that are about when people come into the library, maybe get 100 or so people a day. We just say, are you new to the city? And you can discover the city from another perspective, from the hidden lives of women. There needs to be very many more women of colour in these. Some of these are old and it's taken a long time for us to winkle out the history, so they're ready to be reviewed. But anyway, you get an idea there about what that's about. And at the reception desk, you'll see we've been doing this for many, many, many years, is sort of making these programmes that, you know, you have programmes here, that programmes for most organisations, but this is history. This is evidence of what is happening. And again, thinking about in 100 years' time, it's going to be really significant to know exactly what was happening in Glasgow at this particular time in history. But at the front desk, there are copies of the current and the last programme, just to give you an idea of what we're doing now and how this idea of looking back to look forward and looking at past publications to think about publishing into the future, how that's actually working just now in Women's Library. So I think I'll probably leave it at that.
Thank you so so-much, Adele. Like within the 60 minutes, I feel like I read a book of 600 pages.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and it gave me so much to think about and reflect. And I'm so glad to see that, you know, our two organizations actually have a lot of kind of overlapping missions, right? And also interests, or even some part of the histories. It's just really fascinating to me.
I do too, and I think that we've been talking the last wee while in the library about sometimes it's the thing, you know, like thinking we've got to have an exhibition, we've got to do this, that and the other, and I think sometimes just thinking doing fewer things but with that end output, just it really making a difference, and looking at the new publication that's going to be launched tomorrow, just because we've been talking about it so recently, I just thought, oh, you know, it's the way to go, you know, because our organisations are still doing that pathfinding work. You know, there isn't another organisation like this in the UK, and there isn't, we are the sole accredited museum dedicated to women's history in the UK as well. I mean, you would imagine that there would be more. You'd imagine that there'd be more wonderful places like this. But, you know, there is that precarity. I mean, I know that you're robust, everything's fine, and the same for Women's Library, but you never know how the tide turns, and the idea of having this almost like ballast of material and evidence of what you have done. I think it's still a political thing. I think it's still an important bit of evidence that things have happened, that ideas are there, and so on and so forth. And for those that can't see a show, you know, at least there is a record that really, really well represents what an artist was doing, and, you know, that rich detail that you've managed to sort of bring together in that publication.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the first things you mentioned in today's talk about visibility, right? You know, the way you curate, the way you consider your strategy the first question is really about what's not seen, you know?
Yeah.
And it makes me think the reason why we position this talk here is because we want to be seen. It's so important. You know, just now, you know, in the past hour, there have been hundreds of people passing us by,
Yes.
right? You know, but it's really important, like they might not have the time right now to visit us, but some of them, I'm sure, they will question, you know, what is happening in this gallery,
Yes.
you know? What are all those group of women and a couple of gentlemen, you know, that, you know, sitting in this, like, you know,
Yeah.
it's gorgeous weather outside, you know, and also, of
Yeah.
course, there's the Moon Festival celebration in Chinatown, but what are those
Yeah.
people doing here, you know,
Yes.
they're not like drinking, eating, but they're listening to someone talking. It must be something very important, you know, that she's talking about.
Yeah.
Actually, I have a couple of questions, if that's okay.
Yes, of course.
The first question has to do with kind of artists and the community.
Yeah.
Because you mentioned that your background was like an artist, you went to art school.
Yes.
But then, and also like, I feel like the question is about your own practice and background coming from, you know, artistic experience, but then also another part is about the community of Women's Library.
Yes.
You know, and how do you, can you kind of contextualize that transition, you know,
Yes.
for yourself? And also how does it inform, you know, the intended audience group for Women's Library?
Yes. That's a great question. And I think we maybe touched on this when we were at another gathering a wee while ago. So forgive me if it is a bit of a repetition, but I remember a few years ago going to, I was part of a workshop with a feminist artist called Suzanne Lacey, and she'd been involved in the first Woman House project in America in the 70s, so she's one of those sort of like, you know, contemporaries of the Spare Rib publication that you saw circulating. And she was talking about her rage and activism in the 70s in the States, and how her milieu or her circle of pals had gone on, had taken their activism into different contexts, and one had become a lawyer, and a few had become involved in local and national politics, and some people had done different things, some had become writers. And she had developed what we'd now call the socially engaged practice. So she was working with communities, and mainly in Oaklands, in California. And she'd worked with this particular community as an artist, doing really, really hard hitting stuff for, I think, nearly 30 years, or maybe 20 odd years. And as I was listening to Lacey, I was thinking, a lot of people say to me, do you miss art making? You know, do you still keep a practice going? Because I had been an artist in the conventional sense. But going to hear Lacey, I just sort of thought, the Women's Library, for me, is almost like a long-term collaborative artwork, you know, in itself. And that there are elements of it. And I suppose the publishing side of it allows me to sort of still have that creative aspect in a more obvious type of way. I mean, obviously working with very many creatives and with communities and so on and so forth. I suppose now it's almost like artists do work in that way, don't they? More often they do. There are very, very few artists who paint or work with clay, or just, you know, there's often artists are working in very, very multifaceted ways, like the artists that everybody should go and see in the gallery just now, you know, so that might involve film or photography or text and so on and so forth. So I feel that my practice is probably a socially engaged practice, working with people in a collaborative way as well. I would say that most of the artists that I work with are proper artists, you know. I mean, I don't feel like I am a proper artist, but I've managed to keep that creative energy live in my own work in Women's Library.
That's wonderful. Just a side note, Susan Lacey's work is on view at the Manchester Art Gallery.
Oh, right.
She did a wonderful collaboration with Wine Society, which is only around the corner from us.
Right.
So Wine Society, they are
Right.
one of the oldest non-profit organization in the UK supporting like women's rights and helping migrants, especially from Asia, and working with elderly people.
Great.
So that's another great connection.
Good. I'm glad she's still doing the business. Yeah.
Could you kind of because it seems that only like a couple of us have actually visited, Women's Library.
Yes.
We should really organize a trip to Glasgow. But could you like describe to us what's the experience like, for a visitor?
Yes. Oh, that's a very, very good question. We are in a great location now, probably about a 10-minute walk from just the very edge of the city centre. So we are accessible to many people. But as I say, it's in an area that needs us. We need them, so we are in a neighbourhood, and a neighbourhood that's not had a lot of love and attention, and not a lot of cultural, not at all, don't worry about it. There's a reason for us being there. But I would say that we've had to think about, it is a beautiful local library building that was empty when we moved into it, and I think it's a really, really beautiful library, but I have to sort of think how off-putting it might be to some people who are seeing it, and it's a lovely facade and so on and so forth. So that's one of the reasons why I've been trying to think about the threshold. I mean, as you say, this is so much better because people can see and they can see what's happening, and these are nicely illustrating. Hello. Yeah. So, it's great. We don't have that same thing. So our foyer is really, really important. So a few years ago, we managed to get funding for the flagpole and funding to allow for films to be shown in the foyer. So we wanted local people to really sort of feel like they're going to be welcomed in, or visitors. Quite a lot of our regular learners are people who are developing their reading and writing skills. And as you can imagine, sometimes it takes years to pluck up the courage to go to say, I'm 60 and I'm not a confident reader, or I want some information on, and it might be a sensitive topic or whatever. So we know that for some people it's taken them an enormous amount of courage to get to our door. So we shifted the physical space around so that people can see, not us going, ha, like this, but more or less like there are friendly faces there. And we took away a wall so that people can see where they're coming in. And on our website, we try, because obviously with people who might have different needs in terms of information about the space before they visit, what they're likely to encounter. So, but once they're in, I suppose we really, really try and take care to sort of say, you don't have to be there for a reason. There are loads and loads of places where you can sit and think and work and read, and when you're in the library, you don't have to be going for a particular event. We always offer people a tea and coffee when they come in, and it's free, and because there's so few places now where you can go that you don't have to pay. What I really love is that people encounter things that they maybe don't expect. So in order to walk through to go to an ESOL class, people might be walking through a book cafe session, or they might be seeing a performance taking place. And I think that idea of gaining, I think they call it cultural capital, don't they, is a very random thing. We either had the good fortune of getting support and might have had a good or bad educational experience. I think about the Women's Library as a place where you can be fast-tracked. You're going to come across filmmakers and writers and artists, and just as you're walking around the building. What I really, really love is that there's people of all ages in, and I know that might seem a bit like, well, obviously, but actually I think places do tend to be quite age-specific now. I don't know if others feel that, but you will find people of every age feeling at home in the women's library.
No, that's really beautiful. Yeah. So I wonder, has anyone ever asked you, why do you receive arts funding, and why are you an arts organization?
Oh yes, absolutely. I mean, you know, we get our fair share of. I suppose not so much now. In the past, it was like, why a women's library? Why not a men's library? And so on and so forth. Hundreds of. In fact, we used to have a training session in the library for all the volunteers and the staff every year to say, how would you answer the question, why a women's library? Because there's no one answer, but we would have to get really, really confident in it because it happens so often. That happens less often now, but I think certainly as the cost of living crisis is really hitting, and austerity is the same thing. I think we were talking earlier on about how different it feels in Manchester to Glasgow, that it feels in Manchester that there is a cultural plan and that there is some sort of investment in culture as a sort of not just like a luxury that we can't afford, but actually something really important. And I fear in Glasgow that's not quite the case now. So I think that certainly when people are finding it hard to heat their homes or buy food or all the other essentials that people have, we have to really understand ourselves why we should be getting funding. We've been talking a lot the last wee while about, you know, this sort of rhetoric about warm spaces and libraries becoming warm banks or warm spaces. And I think we want to think beyond the warm bank, you know, so how could you actually create a space where people can come and actually learn how to campaign against cuts that mean that they can't afford them, you know, political literacy. So we're now sort of working towards a programme that we just got a bit of funding for the first bit of it, of drawing on the history of the last 30 years and what we've been trying to do with some of the key themes that we've tried to draw through our work over the years, whether it's anti-racism or whether it's around access or LGBTQ stuff or whatever, and think, could we run almost like summer schools, feminist summer schools, or I think somebody was talking about heritage schools or whatever, where we're maybe using the starting point of past exhibitions or past programmes or whatever, and then leaping into the future with new groups of people to sort of say, what would you want to do and how would you want to do it? So we are sort of thinking, say with the political literacy, looking at some of the projects we've done in the past, but then maybe getting people wised up on how they write a petition, how they lobby their local MP, how they create a banner, how they, you know, become activists. So rather than, I suppose, Imi Cower in Birmingham was talking about this recently and sort of saying these civic spaces that we've got, we're increasingly seeing when there's floods or when there's different crises, whether they're COVID or whatever, that suddenly sleeping bags are in the sort of main lobbies of big ballet companies or theatres or whatever, and it's like these emergency conditions. But how could we get people involved before the emergency and use them every day of the week, you know, as well as we possibly can? And I suppose that's one way that I feel that we could mitigate this question, why are you getting funding? I mean, I still get, my blood boils still, you know, all these years on, 33 years on, thinking sometimes when I see, although all my colleagues do lovely work in the cultural sector, but there is still a big difference between the money that we get and some of our counterparts get. You know, it's still, there's still that inequity in what we manage to do and what some other organisations manage to do. And I think that still gets me a little bit riled, because it feels like the ask of organisations like our own is always bigger than the ask of others. You know, there's always an assumption like, why have you not got a crash 24/7? How can you be a women's library? Why do you not have a cafe open? Why do you not, you know, what are you doing for different types of communities? And obviously we're in that sort of real white heat of all the gender complexity discussions now in the Women's Library as well. So trying to make sure that we are for all in every respect, you know, so we are an open archive, we're transpositive, we're, you know, supportive of non-binary, you know, but you can imagine the trolling that we're getting from other quarters there is quite difficult. So I think that idea of like being accountable for the money that you do get and being open to change and staying relevant is really, really critical. You know, we are lucky to get the funding that we have. We're critical when others get it without, you know, doing as much. But I think it is important to answer the questions that people have about why you should be funded.
That was incredible. Yeah, thank you so much.
We
We have a very dedicated audience today, so I want to ask one more question, and maybe we'll open the floor.
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
So the next question is about the future. You know,
Yes.
Another point taken, you know, from your talk, which I find, you know, really inspiring, is about when you look at a piece of publication, it's not just about tomorrow's the launch, right? It's also about in 10 years, in 20 years, it's making history. You know, I think because this organization, some of you might know, you know, we recently went through like a revisioning process.
Yes.
You know, so in our own eye, we see ourselves sort of like a young organization again. You know, we're
Yes.
kind of like taking those like small steps, you know, like testing new ideas, experimenting, new strategies. But it's very important to have this, you know, 10-year, 20-year vision.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I think that after COVID, I felt that lots of things had sort of ossified a little bit or shriveled a little bit, and I think hope and vision were sort of casualties really of the COVID period. And we paused our strategic planning and visioning process until we felt like that hope and that vision was starting to sort of like germinate again. And our strategic planning only happened a week and a half ago. And one of the exercises that we did was obviously thinking about what we could learn from the last 30 years, because the last 18 months we've been doing a 30-year anniversary project, looking at all the materials, as you can see in some of the slides. But we did an exercise where everybody in the team, because our strategic planning, it involves all the staff and all the board working together, we asked them to draw their image of the Women's Library in 30 years' time and invent a character who was going through the door in 30 years' time. It was quite alarming because some of the visions included staff who were quite elderly already, not myself, and they were still there in 30 years' time in the vision, and I think they were like, no, for goodness sake, please, I'm not going to be there. But it was really interesting just sort of thinking about how the digital, how AI, how all these, you know, obviously there's some more futuristic type things, but I suppose that idea of having hope when there's uncharted waters ahead. I mean, how much turmoil has the world been in terms of the deficit of global leadership, all the incredible geopolitical shifts that are happening in the world. I think it's really important to have these sorts of North Stars for all our organisations. Like, I like to think about you here and our sister projects around the world, almost like this satellite with connective tissues between us, all doing different things, but actually it holding us firm, knowing that those things are happening and that there's a progressive movement for change. But I think it's really important when you work in, I don't know whether you feel this yourself, but I think the type of work that you're doing and the type of work we're doing, it's almost like you are the default. Maybe it's not quite the same, but the default for me is that we're always failing because there's always so much to do. You know, that we're never quite doing as much as we should be doing, you know, because you are addressing inequities really in terms of representation or programming, or, you know, that you've got to do more and you're always going to be failing. And I think that can be demoralising sometimes. So I think it's really important to have that long-term vision and not knowing but feeling hopeful that something astonishing is going to happen. I know when we first started the library, we'd never really have imagined that we could have, 26 staff. It's not a massive organisation, but that would have even having one person funded, getting a wage in the Women's Library would have been an amazing achievement at that time. So I think that idea of doing that, at intervals, we have done that in our strategic planning. And I remember once, one year, I think we went from 6 to 14 staff within that strategic planning period, and all the things that we'd visioned in that sort of what could it be like had been realised. So I don't think it's just like manifesting it, because how does that happen? But I think that idea of saying, well, why not? We might as well hope for that is a really, really important thing to do.
Oh, thank you so much.
Not at all.
Just a quick comment, I get feedback from my side. I totally resonate with what you said. Like, organizations like us, we often feel like we can never do enough, right? But then my hope in the long term is for other people to feel aspired enough to launch their own center or art space. They feel like Easy can do it. They have less than 10 people, but because of their size, there's this other arena they cannot touch upon, but let me do it or let us do it, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, right. And then one thing I have really find amazing is, like, for example, when I go to London, I meet partners or founders, and then they would ask how much Arts Council fund us, because in their mind, they see us as this national center for Asian contemporary art. It sounds very large, Then I tell them how much we're funded. They're like, no way, we need to triple that. I was like, yes, let's work towards that,
Definitely, definitely.
Great.
I love that idea that you mentioned there. Almost like, I think somebody told me, is it like mycelium sort of idea about growth as well, that the idea of not just growing into an empire, because we wouldn't want that, but almost like how it's almost like things are seeded, ideas are seeded, and then when the right conditions prevail, things grow up like mushrooms, because there is that idea, and you can feel hopeless sometimes. But having, say, colleagues who might meet you and understand your work and what you're trying to do and feel inspired, you're not necessarily knowing that you're germinating something there. And then suddenly the right conditions prevail and another wonderful counterpart sets up that has been inspired by this model or inspired by Women's Library or whatever. So I really like that idea of almost like seeding other ideas that are specific to their locale.
Yes.
That speak to the communities that they're in as well, because everywhere is so different. But that we've got that common values-led practice in the way that we're working. So who knows, in the next wee while there might be lots of organisations setting up that can be added to this constellation of great projects in the UK and further afield.
Yeah, absolutely. So on that hopeful note, any audience member would like to ask questions or any feedback or comments?
Not so much a question as feedback, so I've got to go. But thank you so much. That was really interesting, really informative, really inspiring. I feel a couple of points, I really agree with you around the ideas of its intersectionality, even in the context of having these buildings where we educate, inform, entertain, all this stuff within this community, and I would say that we need to appeal to wider communities, because there's so much intersectionality even in this space that I'm standing in 2 minutes, that it feels like you're missing out on a whole genre of other people all around you that are doing things that have a section of this particular Asian-inspired, work. You talked about that exhibition of reggae music before. It's a massive Chinese community in the Caribbean, and there's a community here that probably isn't aware of that, and there's an intersectionality right there. But I love one thing I wanted to say is this feeling of entitlement keeps coming into my head. And you know, why is it so political these days, or why do people not want to think that art and creativity is political, or to try and dampen that down? And there's this feeling all of a sudden that it's become this entitled thing for the privileged few, and it feels like we're going back to that space and time. And for me, it feels really urgent that we get into schools and get into those young minds as quickly as possible to sort of explain to them, this is an entitlement, this is for your health. I am a mental health practitioner as well as an artist, and so when you said you're not an artist, I kept looking at you thinking, how can I say that? How can you actually say that? You know, it's everything you do and everything you touch, and it's so apparent. And the point to me is that it is holistic, and you know, we live it, breathe it, see it, do it, and I don't see any difference between the therapy and the writing and the aromatherapy and the other things I do. I see it all as part of the same thing, and so I'm pleased and proud to call myself an artist, and I feel like we've got to own that as well, you know, and there's something exciting about the times we're in actually. Yes, you're right, we do fail a lot, but maybe that's part of the work as well, the failing, you know, and the fact that we just have to keep going. We just got to keep on keeping on. There's nothing. Sorry, I'm not some friendly in the excitement of it all.
I wanted to pick up on that really vital point that you made there as well. Thank you ever so much for that contribution. But just the sort of jeopardy that there is when arts, we know that hopefully people will forgive me for being political, but I think the erosion of art education or exposure to art at an early age is criminal. Do you know, and I think that will be compounding that idea of elitism and that art is only for the few and so on and so forth.
It's true. I mean, we were actually in a museum last week, my daughter and I, and there were some boys outside that she knew from school, and you know, they were just messing about on their bikes, and I said, do you think the person at reception is going to go out and talk to them? And she went, oh, they won't come in, they don't think they're allowed to be in here. And she just said it so casually, but it was so true, you know, and there are people that are excluded for whatever reason, but they don't feel entitled. So it is really important to make sure that everyone understands that it is for everyone.
It's reminded me that of often in Women's Library we're talking a little bit about how as our organisations grow and develop, there's an ask of us from either academic institutions or the mainstream to sort of like help them in their EDI work or that type of thing. I'm just sort of thinking about with small teams, how onerous, how much labour is involved in that type of work and everything. But we had a request from a place that will remain nameless in Glasgow that's a sort of quite a big institution, and they'd asked what was formerly known as a Black, Asian and minority ethnic development worker in the library, who's been working with us for many years. We've got an inquiry in. So we've got these lads who are, you know, sort of like hanging around our foyer or outside the building, and we just want to know whether you'll come in and work with a team to sort of like develop a strategy for how we could. And she just went, just say, come in. It was like, you know, it's not rocket science. You know, like, you're a human being, they're human beings. They're literally on your doorstep. Do you know what I mean? It's just sort of like, what's gone wrong when, you know, they think they need to sort of pay somebody to go and say, well, you need to, it's like, just sort of say, do you want to come in? Or, you know, that type of thing. But anyway, thank you ever so much for that contribution.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And come and see the show as well before the end of November. Definitely, nice to see you.
Well, it sounds like that institution, first of all, is very well funded, right? So they have the luxury to even consider, hiring someone externally
Yes.
to tackle, a question that should really, be kind of considered more internally first. Right. So for us, we're a small organization. So in terms of EDI, we try to first of all implement it in our hiring practice.
Yes.
We make sure it's the right people running this organization.
Yes,
right?
exactly. And I must say that I think across the communications here, and I mean, I think that contribution there was really great to sort of hear how it feels. I think it's the behaviours and the communications and all the things that you do that are subtle indications of a more deeply rooted EDI strategy and the type of leadership that's in place here. So, but it's for some reason, I think other organisations do generally find it hard to sort of get what seems like quite a straightforward thing sorted out. But were there more? Did I see a hand up earlier on? Or did you?
No, but I've got things to say.
Yes.
I thought you were very sort of passionate argument for the importance of physical publication and something that we can be collected something that has a legacy. And I think you also touched upon a couple of things that could be a challenge now as well, which is challenging funding the environment that everybody's finding themselves in is one thing. Also that need to not use some paper. You talked about net zero and things like that.
Yeah.
And I think it used to be standard to have a catalogue with an exhibition, not that long ago really, but every exhibition in Glasgow would have some kind of catalogue or publication which would allow the artist to have that legacy and the sort of collectible thing with an ISBN number and those things. So I suppose in the light of that really, you both got you've said you've got publication coming out, you've got the publication launched tomorrow. What's the story of those two publications? How are you kind of managing, and do we need to rethink how those things look and produced?
You're so right. I mean, there's so many things in tension, aren't there? I mean, the net zero publication, the irony of it, I think that was our last publication. I think we might have had a print run similar to your print run, the publication that you're launching tomorrow. And I think one of the things that we're holding in tension there is the most recent statistics in Glasgow for people. I think it's 34 or 35% of people in Glasgow don't have broadband. Now that it astonished me it was that high. So this idea that everybody can access the things digitally, it's just almost like holding those things in tension, thinking we won't go for a massive print run. We've started doing these printing program things, we found a printer who is like ethical and green and so on and so forth, and green inks and all that type of thing, but also sort of printing only as many as we need at a certain time and then reprinting at intervals, and it is more expensive. But it is almost like, I think we're thinking that's something we can live with if it means we've not got boxes and boxes of publications, because it feels quite random. It's not like we've fine-tuned it so we know exactly how many are used. It's like sometimes millions of them go out and sometimes a small number. So we've tried to do these little incremental things, but I suppose while there's still this digital divide, I feel really reticent to move to wholly digital. But I don't know, what's your thinking? Have you had to think about these questions about publishing in terms of environment and cost the last wee while?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think for our strategy, like the publication we launch tomorrow, so that's actually for the news exhibition. There are like a couple of essays. It's really important to actually, enable people to read it, in their hands. Of course, we will also launch a digital version later, but we want to kind of honor this practice, the amount of kind of knowledge and skills and also collaboration that have been invested into, this project that's in addition to the exhibition itself. And then, so the way we have produced it is, basically it's a newspaper print, so we're able to print like a small print run, quite limited, you know, then we can kind of observe, you know, the appetite for that, you know. But for accessibility, we will also launch a free digital version. And then I think, you know, for our future strategy, we'll always, you know, make sure that it's like recycled paper and also printed in the UK, or maybe, you know, maybe most distant will be like in the EU. You know, we don't really see any reason, you know, to print large quantity overseas, and you know, to save individual cost. Because I think nowadays the priority really, you know, is about the content, but also about materiality, sustainability, and we would want to, I think, promote that strategy, as well as kind of welcome people who share similar ideas, you know, to come to appreciate those publications.
Your question also reminds me, and your response as well, Joanna, has reminded me recently we got some suggestions from our staff team members. I think I circulated the walking maps earlier on, and as I say, some of them were devised many years ago. I think about 20 years ago they started to be developed. And it was before we had as much information as we have now of some women of colour that we would now want to include in the maps. And I think we were sort of thinking we will, and others as well, maybe other minoritised women that we would want in the maps if we were to redo them. And we've been re-editing them in terms of the walking tour, so the guides that take people around, get more information and get a more diverse picture. And the online version is gradually being edited. But some of my colleagues had sort of said, but they need to be reprinted because there is almost like a different value to a printed version, and that you are almost like keeping this idea of the minority representation in the way that you are developing this. So you're almost like saying that the white women in history are there tangible in that, and the black women remain, or the women of colour remain marginalised because of the form of publishing. So there's all these incredibly complex dances that you've got to do, you know, like whatever happens, you want to make sure that you're not perpetuating these systems that meant that white privilege prevailed, or, you know, but at the same time the costs of reprinting, and that as and when you're getting information all the time, but at the same time just making sure that you want to, you know, that you are doing what you can to make sure that that material is relevant to all and representative of all. So it's difficult to achieve.
I think the good news is that I teach at the Manchester School of Art, and book binding is so popular. So many of the students are really wanting to do hands-on, you know, really interesting book binding and zines. We've got Rise and stuff going on. So it seems to be that kind of return to the physical.
It is incredible. Yeah. The archival turn, you know, the interest that there is in archives, and especially this idea of countercultural archives, museums and libraries, that has just taken us all back complete about where has that come from, but also that sort of, we're talking earlier on about the haptic and the tangible and the sort of the real stuff, you know, there is that unbelievable appetite for that by lots of young people, which is fascinating, you know, and the allure of these things that were printed on an Amstrad, you know, the pain and the agony that went through the production of those things, and you just think, why would anybody want to do that when they could just sort of desktop publish or do it on a you know, an Apple Mac or whatever. But yeah, there's something really very, very interesting.
In this value,
yeah. Just when we were leafing through the publication earlier, it's just that sort of something really exciting about the page turning process. I don't know whether it's just, I'm going to say that, aren't I, from Women's Library, but I don't know, there's something banal about the scrolling, you know, the digital scrolling. I don't know what it is. Even though we were talking the other day about technologies like slide technologies, as well as, you know, slides that used to be produced and so on and so forth, and how the saturated colour of the digital, I never would have imagined how gorgeous images could be and how beautiful, you know, digital images could be, but nevertheless there's something still alluring in a really particular way about a printed image too.
On a slide.
Slides, yes, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much.
Not at
Thank you
all.
so much. Yeah, you've taken us on a journey.
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you so much for inviting me. It's absolutely brilliant to be in Manchester and so wonderful to be in esea, and I just think it would be great just to be imagining in 30 years' time what's going to be happening here, you know, as even next year what's going to be happening here is very exciting. So thank you ever so much for coming along, and lovely to see you all. Thanks very much.
Oh, thank you.
Ellen.
It's been a real privilege.
Thank
And
you.
thank our audience today.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you so much.
Thank you for staying this afternoon with
Cheers.
us.
And do see the show if you do get a chance to. It's just amazing.